Danny Craig here with the Worldview in 5 Minutes and Generations radio team. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear from you. Would you take a few minutes to fill out a survey and share your thoughts with us to help us shape the future of our resources and podcasts here at Generations? It's quick, and as a thank you, we'd love to give you a free ebook of Kevin Swanson's latest book, Heaven Struck, and also enter you in a giveaway for a $500 gift card to our store. Visit generations.org/survey to share your thoughts. That's generations.org/survey.
Yeah, homosexuality was just commonplace in Berlin, and it was significant in the development of the Nazi Party. There's no question that early Nazis that were unified with Adolf Hitler at the beginning were homosexuals. I mean, that's common knowledge. Okay, we're not talking about something controversial at that point. The degree to which, right, like Rome and so forth, the degree to which the homosexuals were involved is perhaps a matter of debate, and I get that. But the police were tolerating these homosexual bars in Berlin. It was a global center for homosexual prostitution. Also, Berlin was the home to burgeoning homosexual movement led by German's Jewish physician, a sexologist by the name of Magnus Hirschfeld. So again, if you study homosexual history, all of these guys play an important role, and homosexuals will look back upon Berlin in the 1920s as the birthplace for the modern homosexual movement just about everywhere else in the world today. And welcome, my friends, to the Generations radio broadcast. Kevin Swanson, your host with you. Adam McManus from theworldview.com also on this edition. Welcome, Adam. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, where we are today is we're dealing with the fall of Western civilization. I don't think there's any exaggeration there. That's why I wrote the book Epoch, The Rise and Fall of the West, which I would highly recommend to our listening and viewing audience. This is the most significant event in world history since roughly 476 AD at the fall of Rome. I mean, the fall of all of Western civilization, the fall of Europe, the fall of North America seems to me to be a pretty significant event, much bigger, certainly in terms of land mass and population than what the Roman Empire dealt with. And we're looking at a fall of the Christian influence in the West, but not just that. It's the undermining of the foundations upon which Western civilization was built over 1,000 years. And that just simply means that the Christian worldview upon which our entire civilization was built is jackhammered out from under us, which means that the civilization itself cannot stand. You simply can't continue a civilization if you're jackhammering out what used to be the foundation of that civilization. That seems to me to make a lot of sense. Well, this story from England just appeared on the Worldview this week, Adam. I think it's a symbolic indication of the fundamental issue and the problem with England. Charles III and the royal family in London showed all kinds of support for the annual Pride March via social media over the weekend. First time ever. Elizabeth never did any of this, and I don't think they did it the last year or two, but 35,000 Brits participated in this Pride March. By the way, if anybody ever invites you to like a Pride March that celebrates some form of sexual lust, probably not a good idea to be a part of that because, well, as we've said many times before, pride comes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. And that's precisely what we said, by the way, in 2019 at the point at which, it was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, and it was the largest pride marches in the history of the world. And in July of 2019, we said, I asked Bill Jack, what comes after Pride, Bill? And he says, the fall. I said, well, that's exactly what we're going to see. We're going to see the fall come. What comes after summer? We said fall. And sure enough, it was COVID-19 that hit and shut the whole world down for about 2 years. Okay, so pride comes before a fall, and that's what's happening to England right now. Certainly the fall of English civilization is happening as Charles III demonstrates all kinds of support for the homosexual Pride March in London.
The royal family X account featured the royal band playing the iconic homosexual transgender anthem entitled Pink Pony Club, which was originally released by Chapel Roan. A comment about her in a moment. But They also drew attention to celebrations, these sinful celebrations, by adding to the caption, hashtag Pride 2025, alongside emojis of a rainbow, which they didn't reference in terms of, God promising never to flood the world again, but of course the representation it has come to mean about the homosexual world and lifestyle, a disco ball, and sparkles. One person rightly said on the X account in reaction, "What a terrible post. No wonder at the coronation the king chose not to say, quote, defender of the faith, capital F, end quote. The monarchy ended with our beloved late queen." And another asked, "Isn't the king the head of the Church of England? He should not be promoting sins." Well, Chapel Roan is a 27-year-old lesbian singer who was born Kaylee Amstutz, and she comes from a conservative Christian southern state and wrote a song called The Pink Pony Club. She has talked about dreaming in this song about going to a homosexual bar and drag club culture in West Hollywood in Santa Monica Boulevard. And here are some of the lyrics to give you a sense of what King Charles III was using his throne, his platform internationally, to affirm. "I know you wanted me to stay, but I cannot ignore the crazy visions of me in LA. And I heard that there's a special place where boys and girls can all be queens every single day. I'm having wicked dreams of leaving Tennessee. Here, Santa Monica, I swear it's calling me. Won't make my mama proud." Of course, she represents the Christian values. "It's going to cause a scene. She sees her baby girl. I know she's going to scream. What have you done? You're a pink pony girl and you dance at the club. Oh, mama, I'm just having fun. On the stage in my heels, it's where I belong, down at the Pink Pony Club. I'm dancing at the Pink Pony Club. I'm up and jaws are on the floor. Lovers in the bathroom," talking about illicit sexual encounters in the bathroom, no less, "and a line outside the door. Black lights and a mirrored disco ball. Every night's another reason why I left it all." So the lure of sexual sin, drawing her away from her godly Christian heritage, it's tragic in and of itself, and it became a big song. But the fact that King Charles III put his stamp of approval on all of it is an embarrassment to the crown.
She got a Grammy Award for it this year. Best New Artist is my understanding. And whatever the case, what we're looking at is a post-Christian anthem. That is, we are turning away from all of our 1,000 years of Christian heritage. And we're going to celebrate this rebellion and this autonomy, the sexual autonomy as represented by the homosexual movement in the present day. Now, Charles III, his closest relative, his uncle, Mountbatten, was a homosexual and a pedophile. So he had this horrible relationship with a relative as a young boy. And don't forget the children's aunt, that is Elizabeth's children, their aunt on the mother's side, Margaret, was also dissolute on the front page of the National Enquirer of England, whatever that happened to be, for about 20 years. I mean, just the sort of scandals that she represented was horrific, but all demonstrating the slow but steady decline and destruction of the monarchy, but not just the destruction of the monarchy, Adam, but the destruction of the Christian faith in England and the undermining of an entire civilization. Charles definitely represents that, being the divorcee as well as an adulterer. So not only was his closest relative, his mentor, a homosexual and a pedophile, but Charles himself, an adulterer and a divorcee. And now the next in line to the throne, Prince William, has publicly approved of homosexuality as well. So this has been the decline of whatever was left of conservatism or whatever is left of a Christian heritage in England over a period of 1,000 years. We're looking at, everything that was left from Athelstan, King Alfred, I'm talking about 1,000 years ago, of Christian law and Christian faith has been utterly decimated in England, which means we're dealing with the most serious problem in the history of the world since roughly 476 AD. So that's why, again, I wrote my book, Epoch, the Rise and Fall of the West, because I do think these are very, very critical times. We're looking at the destruction of the Western world and the judgment of Almighty God, which will come down upon England. I think that's inevitable at this point.
Queen Elizabeth II was known for her Easter and her Christmas messages, which weren't just, politically correct, let's all have a good time and enjoy each other's company type of messages. They were Christ-focused, like a laser beam. She was gracious, but she was a devout Christian and did not hesitate to use her platform to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it was a glorious thing to behold, to see a person of influence like Queen Elizabeth II affirm Christ and his teaching as she did. And yet, sadly, her son, King Charles III, did not learn those biblical lessons. And I fear that, as you've indicated, Prince William is headed in the same wrong direction.
Yeah, and my wife and I have been watching some of The Crown, which is a series on the life of Elizabeth II. I recommend it through filtering. But what's interesting is that her husband did not share her faith. It's pretty obvious. Elizabeth was known for praying at her bedside on her knees on a daily basis. She recognized God, and she took the advice from Billy Graham fairly seriously in one particular section of the series. And as you said, her Christmas messages, some of them were really just excellent. Towards the end, she said something like this: "This is the time of the year when we remember that God sent his only son to serve, not to be served. He restored love and service to the center of our lives in the person of Jesus Christ." Also in 2011, God sent into the world a unique person, neither a philosopher nor a general, but a savior with the power to forgive.
There you go.
Forgiveness lies at the heart of the Christian faith, and so on and so forth. So these were the sorts of messages. Meantime, Charles II, you remember we commented on Charles II's recent holiday message for Easter, and he would not refer to the Christian faith, but rather to Islam. He preferred Islam over Christianity in his most recent Easter message.
On
so there you again
Sunday
see
itself.
the end of the Christian influence in the West. So, friends, that's it. But again, I want to look at some roots of the destruction of the West by turning our attention to World War I and World War II, because here we see the downfall of the Christian faith, whatever is there, in Germany, and the seeds that were planted to bring about World War I, World War II. This is a history lesson. What precipitated World War I and World War II, and what would possibly precipitate World War III? Now, some may say, yeah, Germany was a mess and England's a mess, but we're doing great. America's great. I mean, nothing can possibly go wrong. We're such nice people here. But I think it's helpful to look at what has happened in the past. What was going on in Berlin in 1924? What was happening in Russia, St. Petersburg, in 1905? The rise of homosexuality in Russia and Germany prior to the world wars of the 20th century. You will not believe this, friends. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment. The world is filled with irresponsible men, heartless men, treacherous men, dishonorable men, passive men. God is looking you straight in the eye, man, and he's saying, I'm calling you. Brothers, God is discipling us even as we are discipling our children, loving our children, investing in them. Before you ask the purpose for your life, you need to ask yourself, who are you? I'm the servant of the Lord Jesus Christ. He's given me a reason. He's given me a mission for what I'm supposed to do here on planet Earth. Disciple the nations. Begin with your own family. God calls you to be strong. This is the quintessential definition of a manly character in the Bible. God calls us to be strong. God calls us to be consistent, resilient, to stay in the battle, no matter the obstacle, no matter the demonic opposition set against you. It means we're not intimidated by the enemy because God's not intimidated. And welcome back, my friends, to the Generations broadcast. Kevin Swanson with you. And today we want to take a look at the historical roots of World War I and World War II, largely because we are facing World War III. So I think we need to know something about history. Somebody said if you don't know history, you're bound to repeat it. And it's for us to know the factors that go into these things. Now, typically, when you read history books concerning the startup of certain wars, world wars, etc., they go straight to the catalyst. But there's something more than the catalyst to bring about the World War. There are more fundamental issues that are dividing nations and introducing this kind of devastation upon the entire world. So what would that be? That's my question today. Well, here they are. Number one, there are worldview differences or basic religious and cultural differences that will bring about conflict between nations. Secondly, there are power issues because nations typically battle over power. Power is a concern. Thirdly, there are character issues with leaders that can bring about a world war. Fourthly, there are moral issues within nations that disturb the moral fabric and the social fabric of nations, really destabilizing nations and bringing about world wars. Fifthly, there are economic issues, typically greed, tariffs, that sort of thing, that can introduce world wars or wars between nations. Then sixthly, there is the factor of God's judgment upon the nation. Now, I would say technically that's a first cause. And that's the ultimate cause. God uses the secondary causes, obviously, to bring about his will upon the nations. And then there are certain catalysts, that is the spark that fires off the first shot, so to speak. Well, prior to World War I, Germany was a latecomer in the power game in Europe. Germany stepped in, this would have been at the beginning of the 20th century, Germany stepped in to compete with France and England. You see, Britain and France had established their empires, and they were the world's most powerful colonizing regions around the world. They had already colonized in India, Vietnam, certain parts of Asia, West and North Africa, as well as parts of the Americas. Okay, so that had already happened in the 19th century. But think about it. What did Germany have? I mean, I can't think of any place where Germany was really that active, with the exception of a couple of African nations. So Germany really didn't have much of an empire. You had the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, and the Brits would fight off with the French off and on. The French were losing a grip. Britain was still somewhat powerful, probably the most powerful empire on earth at the turn of the 20th century. But by the time you get to the 20th century, Germany was a latecomer. Now, Germany wanted to, get into the competition. Now, power is intoxicating. Power, I believe, is more alluring and more addictive than money and sex. In fact, I would say, and Adam, you can, debate me on this one, but I believe that this is the highest form of intoxication known to man. I mean, the grabbing for power without the acknowledgement of God as the source of all power and authority is pretty fundamental in the high level competition that we see between nations.
I'm thinking of another maxim. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes. Largely because of the nature of man. Man is given to sinfulness and to lust. But boy, the lust to power. Now, we know the power of the lust to sex, right? I mean, often brings about addictions. Or, say, alcohol, or the power of addiction to money. People just love money. It's a huge draw. I mean, humongous. But wow, the enormous power of the power influence or impulse is beyond. And here's the reason: because man by nature wants to be God. He want, as in the first temptation, ye shall be as gods. And so that is the reason why, once somebody's a power monger, once they're in competition for power on the world scene between nations, that is the sort of thing that brings about a fair amount of competition that leads to war. And typically this happens on the part of certain power-hungry, proud leaders of nations. Now, the catalyst in the case of World War I was where you had a nation like Serbia, similar to Ukraine today. Think about Ukraine today. Ukraine is very interested in its own independence today. But go back into the early 1900s, and Serbia really wants independence from Austria. Okay, so this little nation called Serbia, much like this nation called Ukraine in the present day, this nation called Serbia wanted independence from Austria. Well, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by this gunman, and Ferdinand had been chosen as a target because he was to be the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, bigger nations then played tug-of-war over the nation, like Serbia, as in nations today, seem to be wanting to play tug-of-war over Ukraine. Are you with me? There's a tug-of-war going on over Ukraine.
Yes,
you can see it.
absolutely.
Like one group, the EU is on the one side pulling really hard, and Russia's on the other side pulling hard. Well, the very same thing was happening at the time when World War I is about to begin. Okay, because you have bigger nations playing a tug-of-war over Serbia. Russia was supporting Serbia over there on the east side, and Austria and Germany wanted control over Serbia over on the west side. Now, there's a bit of a tug-of-war going on right now as well. So this is what I would call a catalyst, but there's a power struggle going on at the same time. Also, an alliance formed between France, Britain, and Russia in 1907 called the Triple Entente caused a lot of friction among the nations as well. Okay, but there are also character nations that played in to the world wars of the 20th century. And Germany had a huge issue with pride. Okay, they were pretty strong on what they called "Make Germany Great Again." Okay, so yeah, it was a huge "Make Germany Great" campaign that was waged at the turn of the 20th century. It was very much nationalistic, very much interested in the promotion of their nation against other nations around the world, and they definitely wanted to make Germany great out from under the authority of Almighty God. So another problem. There was an unrealistic, what they called millenarianism going on, or a salvation by the state, salvation to the world by the state kind of worldview that was operating at that time in Germany. Well, meantime, you also had a problem, a morality issue with Russia and Germany being the nations that seem to be giving way to homosexuality faster than all of the other nations in Europe at the time. Russia had a sexual revolution in 1905, 1906. Transvestism, homosexuality exploded on the scene. Homosexuality was especially rampant with the priesthood, which obviously that's going to be rough. And so Russia is actually more on the forefront of the homosexual revolution by the time the Bolsheviks get into play in 1913. So that would have been only 7-8 years later. After their sexual revolution, they began to legalize homosexuality, encourage homosexuality throughout the Soviet Union, at least for a period of time under Lenin. Okay, so Russia had its sexual revolution going on in 1905 and 1906. Meantime, Germany became the homosexual capital of the world, especially Berlin. Berlin was the Sodom of Europe. There's no question. Everybody knows that today. Between 1896 and 1931, so back to 1896, you had something, the first the first national socially acceptable presentation of homosexuality in the world since Pompeii, or since Sodom and Gomorrah, since the Greek Empire of where the Greeks, were practicing pedophilia in the 3-4th century BC. So for the first time in at least 2,000 years, Berlin was the place in the world in which homosexuality was celebrated more than any other place in the world. Now, again, this again was the precursor to the homosexual revolution and World War I, World War II in the early part of the 20th century. So between 1896 and 1931, this German German anarchist named Adolf Brand published the world's first magazine dedicated to homosexuality and what he called self-definition. 7 years before the Great War broke out, the German Kaiser's cabinet and multiple military officers were caught participating in homosexual activities in what is now known as the Harden-Eulenburg affair. So again, this is all history. You can just look it up. Wikipedia will have plenty on this. Not to say that Wikipedia is accurate in everything that it presents, but I'm just saying it's pretty much common knowledge. It's just that nobody ever connects the dots on these sorts of things. So again, this is the cause of World War I and World War II. This is the cause of God's judgment coming down upon the nations in the first part of the 20th century. The apostasy in Germany was strident. It was pretty much complete at that point. Remember, the church was pretty much useless. Even the evangelical church in Germany went for Adolf Hitler. If it wasn't for the evangelicals, he would not have been elected. The Third Reich would not have come into power. So it was the evangelicals that supported Adolf Hitler coming into power later on after World War I. But the righteous God over heaven and earth took notice of this European apostasy. Protestant nations, Germany, England, Catholic nations like France and Italy, they followed ideologies that were strongly anti-Christian. Their leaders refused to confess the name of Christ, and they would not bow to his kingship. They would not listen to his voice, submit to his law. And when the kings and judges of the earth refuse to serve the Lord with fear and kiss the Son, they will most certainly perish from the way. That's Psalm 2. It's a promise. It will happen. He will break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. It's exactly what happened with World War I and World War II. And so I'm quoting from my book, America and God's Providence, Volume 2. So again, this comes from America and God's Providence, our 1,000-page history of what has happened with the United States, America, over the last 500 years. Okay, so the Western world was shifting fast towards Darwinism as well. So keep this in mind. This is another worldview influence that was working hard, playing super, super hard in Germany during these years. Of all the Western nations, Germany had most enthusiastically embraced Darwin's doctrine of survival of the fittest. Okay, because guess what? The Germans were the fittest and they would survive. And might makes right. Nietzsche, of course, playing strongly as well. Nietzsche's materials had been handed out to the soldiers of the Kaiser's army earlier in the 20th century. So again, Nietzsche was playing hard, as was Darwin at the time. The German eugenics Dr. Eugen Fischer was performing live experiments on prisoners by injecting them with smallpox and typhus as early as 1910, 1915, etc. So, friends, we're looking at some pretty serious things going on in the early part of the 20th century, especially in Germany. At the outset of World War I, here's the testimony from Kaiser Wilhelm II. Okay, this is what he said. Now comes the Germanics people, fight for their existence against Russia and France. No further conference can smooth us over, for it's not a question of high politics, but of race. For what is at stake is whether the Germanic race is to be or not to be in Europe. So it's a racist battle. It's a racial battle. And Germany was going to prove itself to be racially superior in the European wars. Okay, so that's the kind of worldview that was functional in World War I. A lot of people say, well, yeah, Adolf Hitler was, problem with racism and such. Survival of the fittest, evolution was affecting him. But Adam, it was just as influential with the Kaiser prior to World War I.
And I would add that you referenced Berlin being a kind of melting pot of sorts of all homosexual activities in the 1920s. I have looked that up. There were 170 homosexual clubs, bars, and pubs back in the 1920s in Berlin alone. 170. I mean, that just shows you this isn't, a couple on the outskirts of town. This is rampant. It's what they celebrate. It's what they embraced, and it's who they became. It was a part of their identity.
Yeah, homosexuality was just commonplace in Berlin, and it was significant in the development of the Nazi Party. Now, there's debate over how significant it was. There's no question that early Nazis that were unified with Adolf Hitler at the beginning were homosexuals. I mean, that's common knowledge. Okay, we're not talking about something controversial at that point. The degree to which, right, like Rome and so forth, the degree to which the homosexuals were involved is perhaps a matter of debate, and I get that. But the police were tolerating these homosexual bars in Berlin. It was a global center for homosexual prostitution. Also, Berlin was the home to burgeoning homosexual movement led by German's Jewish physician, a sexologist by the name of Magnus Hirschfeld. So again, if you study homosexual history, all of these guys play an important role, and homosexuals will look back upon Berlin in the 1920s as the birthplace for the modern homosexual movement just about everywhere else in the world today.
By the way, it would appear to be confusing at first blush because the Nazis did send to the concentration camps homosexuals. So one would immediately ask, how is it that they were in leadership? Well, according to a controversial book back in 1995, The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party, those that were persecuted, those that were put in concentration camps, were effeminate homosexual men, but those who had kind of a heterosexual male veneer of sorts, or more masculine homosexual acting men like Himmler and Goebbels, Göring, were different from the effeminate men that they persecuted.
Yeah, so there's some debate over the degree to which homosexuals were involved in the early Nazi Party, but at the very beginning, it's obvious that Berlin was a cesspool in which all of these revolutionary, anarchical, Nazi type of organizations were getting their beginnings. This is where it started. In fact, there were 25 separate homosexual, lesbian, transvestite journals published in Berlin between 1919 and 1933. Hirschfeld founded a research center that experimented with the first sex reassignment surgeries. So if you want to know where the first transgender surgeries occurred, in Berlin, under the auspices of this German Jewish physician and sexologist.
That was 1897
Magnus
or so.
Hirschfeld, right.
Yeah.
And you just said there were over 100 homosexual clubs and bars, catering to a variety of tastes and backgrounds. Now, you're reading from certain sources. I'm reading from certain sources as well. But Berlin, according to this one author by the name of Beachy, this author, Robert Beachy, is the author of Gay Berlin, Birthplace of the Modern Identity, and he's pretty positive in the development of this wonderful modern culture of homosexuality. That's the whole idea of the book. And this guy says, at the end of the day, Berlin reminds me of what I know about New York and maybe San Francisco in the 1970s. He said you could be out, at least in smaller circles of friends. Lots of prominent cultural figures were pretty widely recognized as homosexual or lesbian. In some cases, they had life or long-term partners, not people to be hidden or embarrassed about. They would have lived their lives quite openly. One such public figure was Ernst Röhm, Hitler's closest friend, one of the earliest members of the Nazi Party and the leader of the SA, the Nazi militia. Again, quite a number of leading Nazis at the beginning were homosexuals. Ernst Röhm was right there with him, with Adolf Hitler. They effectively were the closest of friends. I mean, these were the guys that formed, these were the two guys, Adolf Hitler, Ernst Röhm, formed Nazism in the early 1930s. Also, Edmund Heinz was another founder of the Nazi Party, sentenced to 15 months imprisonment for his part in a failed coup d'etat. He was held in the same cell with Adolf Hitler. So Edmund Heinz, Ernst Röhm were close friends of Adolf Hitler at the very beginning. We're talking about the very, very beginning, and known homosexuals. There's no debate whatsoever about whether these guys were homosexual. They were homosexual. Homosexuality was massive in Berlin. This was a cesspool in which Nazism developed and World War II developed. So that's the beginning of World War II. Now we're looking at the roots of World War II at this stage in our discussion at this point, but also understand there was a tremendous amount of pride going on. Adolf Hitler was a proud man, and again, this isn't what you're going to find in your typical history book. We're going to discuss these things in America and God's providence, but I'm identifying the sins of Germany that yielded a destruction of 100 million people over the subsequent decades. Adolf Hitler was proud, no question. He said he wanted to dispense with, quote, all pretenses of humility. I have footnotes for all of this, by the way. He announced to the Austrian Chancellor in 1938, I have accomplished the greatest things in German history that ever a German was destined to accomplish. So again, huge braggadocio. This is why you want to be very cautious with any politician that speaks like this. I mean, be very careful, because pride comes before destruction. So keep that in mind. He called National Socialism more than a religion. It is the will to a new creation of man. He was also a racist and an evolutionist. He believed that Darwinist doctrine of survival of the fittest to be, quote, the basic law governing the societal conduct of individuals and nations. In May of 1923, he said the Jews were not human, but were the racial tuberculosis of the nations. Also referred to these humans, who were made in the image of God, as parasites and eternal leeches. Very, very bad. One of America's most influential evolutionists also was working hard in Japan. So the reason Japan went into the war was largely because of Darwinism. A certain Professor Edward Morse was enthusiastically received by large Japanese audiences and contributed his entire library to the Tokyo Imperial University. He brought in Darwin's book on eugenics, The Descent of Man. It was translated into Japanese in 1881. The Japanese intellectuals received his materials with great enthusiasm. No language seemed to have produced more different versions of On the Origin of Species than the Japanese language. It was an evolutionist named Herbert Spencer who became the most popular Western political philosopher in Japan by the end of the 19th century. Between 1877 and 1900, 33 translations of Spencer's works were produced. Herbert Spencer is best known for his political and social application of Darwin's doctrine of survival of the fittest. This politicization of Darwin's racism resonated with the Japanese war machine and the Japanese tendency to consider themselves as the most advanced race on Earth. And that quote is included in my book, America and God's Providence. So again, evolution, homosexuality, the pride of men.
Let me just jump in there before you say that one more thing. And that is Adolf Hitler, you described him as dispensing with any remnant of humility and how he embraced pride. I am reminded of King Nebuchadnezzar, who boasted and bragged about how he had built all these things and look what I've done, and patted himself on the back. And God temporarily afflicted him with madness, and he was grazing in a back field, eating grass like an ox.
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that happens when a man lifts himself up and says, I'm the greatest president this nation has ever had. Okay, that's the kind of thing that's going to turn badly, very, very badly, and we've seen that happen before. And by the time the people step in and say, the voice of a God, you can pretty much bet that guy's going to be eaten out by worms. So that's the other thing you have to watch out for. But people say, well, who cares? Politicians always speaking with pride, and homosexuality is, latent in every civilization, et cetera, et cetera. But the point at which it explodes on the scene and becomes dominant in a society and with certain political parties, you can get ready for massive destruction, judgment from the hands of Almighty God coming down upon the world. Okay, so what started World War II? Let me give one more catalyst. So again, we're looking at different categories of causes to bring about massive destruction upon the whole world. Come on, friends, we've got to study history because we're going to be making history in the next few years. Okay, what started World War II? Here it is, tariffs. Okay, let me give you a little bit of background here. Tariffs. The reversion of Congress to Republican control during the First World War and the 1920 election of Republican Warren Harding to the presidency signaled an end to the experiment with lower tariffs. They tried lower tariffs for a while to provide protection for American farmers whose wartime markets in Europe was disappearing with the recovery of European agricultural production as well as U.S. industries that had been stimulated by the war. Congress passed an Emergency Tariff Act in 1921, followed a year later by the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act of 1922. The Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act raised tariffs above the level set in 1913. It also authorized the president to raise or lower a given tariff rate by 50% in order to even out foreign and domestic production costs. One unintended consequence of the Fordney-McCumber tariff was that it made it more difficult for European nations to export to the United States and so earn dollars to service their war debts from the World War I. Okay, so economic pressures become something of a catalyst as well. Now, I just want to apply this to the present day. You say, well, it'll never happen here. Think I'll have another beer. I'd recommend not employing that philosophy concerning history or concerning ourselves in our current state here in the United States of America. We have homosexuals now at the highest rank of governance. We have brought in more tariffs. We have probably more pride going on in the nation today than we've ever had in the history of the country. Russia is pretty desperate for power. I wonder what's going to happen next. All right, well, that wraps up this edition of the Generations broadcast. I recommend to you America and God's Providence. If you don't read history, you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so that's why I'd recommend you read history. This is very readable, by the way. This is 1,000 pages, but a friend of mine, his 12-year-old son, picked this up and he read it over 3 months. Said he couldn't put it down. Read like a novel. Okay, so I'd recommend America and God's Providence. It's an easy read, but wow, so few people know the causes of our world wars or the Christian principles upon which the nation was founded, which is the real goal for producing this series of America and God's Providence, a series of textbooks available at generation.org. We wrote it for 10th graders, but it's just as good for 12-year-olds. This is Kevin Swanson inviting you back again next time as we continue to lay down a vision for the next generation.